In today's video on reading the Bible, I want to identify a good first question to ask while reading the Epistles. The Epistles are the 21 books in the New Testament that are written in the form of a letter. Most of the time when we read the Epistles, the first question we ask is, what does this say to me? Now that's a good question because we need to apply the Bible to our lives. But let me give you a different first question. Instead of asking, what does this say to me? We are going to first ask the question, what did this say to them? We're going to first think about the original recipients of the epistle, the ones who got the envelope in the mail, so to speak. Asking this question first can make the difference between confusion and clarity, right and wrong interpretation. For example, let's say you come across 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. Therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves also with the same attitude, because whoever suffers in the body is done with sin. As a result, they do not live the rest of their earthly lives for evil human desires, but rather for the will of God. So does this mean that if I physically suffer, I sin less? Does this mean I need to suffer to do God's will? This is kind of confusing. But let's first think about them. How are we going to do that? We're going to put ourselves in their shoes. Have you ever discovered a box of old letters from your grandparents? If you have, those letters can be interesting to read. Not only are they a window into the life of your grandparents, but they are also a window into the culture they lived in decades ago. In a similar way, we are going to use the epistle itself as a 2,000-year window to see who they were and what they were going through, so we can answer the question, what did this say to them? 4 different looks will get us there. Look number 1. Read the epistle from start to finish. As you read, look for themes. Read the epistle from start to finish in one sitting. I did this once in a small group. We read through the book of James from start to finish and shared what themes that we saw. It took 20 minutes to read. It took 40 minutes to share. And after 60 minutes, somebody said, I learned more about James in 60 minutes than I did in a 6-week study. Reading from start to finish in one sitting, looking for themes, is that insightful. When you do this with 1 Peter, you see the theme of suffering. It's super easy to see. The word suffer is used 17 times in this epistle. So that's the first look. Look number 2. As you read from start to finish, look for information on the writer. Verse 1:1 tells us that the writer is Peter. Verse 5:1 tells us that he is an elder in the church and was an eyewitness to the sufferings of Christ. This is Peter the apostle. Look number 3. As you read from start to finish, look for information on the recipients. Verse 1:1 tells us that the recipients are Christians who are scattered throughout different cities. Verse 1:6 tells us that they are suffering because of different trials. For these recipients, suffering is not a concept or potential threat. Suffering is part of their life. And finally, look number 4. As you read from start to finish, look for specifics. My wife and I have these old journals at our house. Every now and then we'll look through some of them. Do you ever notice how immature your younger self seems when you look through old journals? Maybe that's just me. When we look through old journals, it's fun to be reminded of the specifics that were going on in our lives, like where we went on our first date or issues we had while planning for our wedding. Well, one specific mentioned in 1 Peter is the reason for suffering. In 2:19 through 20, Peter says it is good if you suffer for our Savior. It is not good if you suffer for sin. So we know that both kinds of suffering were happening. That may have been a question that they asked to Peter as well. Another specific mentioned is retaliation. Verse 2:23 talks about how Christ responded by not retaliating when he suffered. Yet another specific question addressed is if it's God's will when we suffer. Verse 3:17 tells us that sometimes it is God's will that we suffer as a Christian for doing good. So we've looked 4 different times as we read from start to finish. We've looked for themes. We've looked for information on the writer. We've looked for information on the recipients. And we've looked for specifics. After these 4 looks, we now have a window into who they were and what they were going through. So let's go back to our text and answer the question, what did this say to them? Therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, okay, we know that Peter was an eyewitness to Christ's suffering, arm yourself also, well, these Christians were also suffering, with the same attitude. Christ did not retaliate, that was his attitude, because whoever suffers in the body is done with sin. Now, this doesn't mean they're sinless, because Peter addresses their sin while suffering. As a result, they do not live the rest of their earthly lives for evil human desires, but rather for the will of God. Sometimes it is God's will for Christians to suffer for good. Okay, so now we can answer the question the best we can. What did this say to them? Peter said to these Christians, as you guys suffer for Jesus, imitate the attitude of Jesus. Then you will be doing God's will more and, therefore, be sinning less. So that's how I would answer that question, what did this say to them? And by answering that question, I have more clarity than confusion. I have a more accurate interpretation. Now I'm ready to ask the next question, the second question, what does this say to me? And that question will be the topic of our next video. This has been an episode of Reading the Bible. Subscribe to our YouTube channel for more videos like this, and make sure to visit our website, valleybrookchurch.org.